The large auditorium was packed with parents, teachers, and students. Everyone sat quietly, waiting for the next performance at the regional youth music competition. Behind the judges' table sat Judge Richard Hampton, a man known throughout the city for being incredibly tough on performers. At 63 years old, he had seen thousands of young musicians come and go. His gray hair was neatly combed back, and his face rarely showed any emotion during performances. Richard had been judging music competitions for over 20 years. People whispered about him in the hallways. Some called him fair but harsh. Others said he was too strict, that he crushed young dreams with his brutal honesty. But everyone agreed on one thing: if Judge Hampton gave you a high score, you truly deserved it. The other two judges sitting beside him seemed nervous. They always were when Richard was on the panel. He had a way of making everyone feel like they weren't quite good enough. His pen was always ready to mark down every tiny mistake, every missed note, every moment of hesitation. The afternoon sun came through the tall windows, creating long shadows across the wooden stage. The competition had been going on for hours. Richard had watched piano players, singers, and various instrumentalists. Some were good. Most were average. None had impressed him enough to show any real emotion on his face. The host walked to the microphone and announced the next performer. "Ladies and gentlemen, our next contestant is Daniel Rivera. He's 17 years old and a scholarship student from Lincoln High School. Daniel will be performing an original composition on the violin." A thin teenager walked onto the stage carrying an old violin case. His dark hair fell slightly over his forehead, and his white shirt looked freshly ironed but inexpensive. The boy's hands shook a little as he opened his case and took out his violin. It wasn't a fancy instrument, anyone could see that. The wood was worn in places and the bow had seen better days. Daniel adjusted the microphone stand, which was too tall for him. He had to lower it twice before getting it right. A few people in the audience smiled at his nervousness. Some parents whispered to each other, probably wondering if this nervous kid could really perform well. Richard barely looked up from his score sheet. He had already made some assumptions. Scholarship student, old violin, original composition, which usually meant the student wasn't skilled enough to play the classical masters properly. He expected this would be another mediocre performance that he'd have to sit through politely. The boy took a deep breath and positioned his violin under his chin. His stance was actually quite good, Richard noticed. At least someone had taught him proper form. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, seeming to gather his courage. The auditorium fell completely silent. Even the whispers stopped. That moment before a performance always felt heavy, full of possibility and fear mixed together. Parents leaned forward in their seats. The other judges picked up their pens, ready to take notes. Daniel opened his eyes and raised his bow to the strings. His hand steadied as he prepared for the first note. Richard tapped his pen against his score sheet, already thinking about what criticism he would offer. In his mind, he was preparing the usual speech he gave to young musicians who weren't quite ready for serious competition. But Richard had no idea that in the next few moments, everything he thought he knew about music, about loss, and about his own past was about to be turned completely upside down. This wasn't going to be just another forgettable performance on another long afternoon. This was going to be the moment that changed everything. The bow touched the strings and the first notes began to fill the room. Clear, pure, and hauntingly beautiful. Richard's pen stopped tapping. Something about that melody made him freeze. His body went rigid in his chair and his breathing became shallow. Those notes, that exact sequence of sounds, it couldn't be. It was impossible. After all these years, after convincing himself he'd never hear it again outside his own memories, here it was, real and alive and filling the auditorium. Richard's mind started racing. His heart pounded in his chest. The score sheet in front of him blurred as tears unexpectedly formed in his eyes. He gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady himself, trying to understand what was happening. Daniel continued playing, unaware of the storm he had just unleashed in the old judge's heart. The melody flowed from his violin like water, natural and effortless. It was the kind of music that made people stop whatever they were doing and just listen. But for Richard, this wasn't just beautiful music. This was something far more personal, far more impossible. This was a voice from his past, a memory he thought was buried forever, a piece of his heart he thought he'd lost when he buried his wife 5 years ago. His hand began to rise almost on its own, trembling in the air. The other judges glanced at him, confused by his strange behavior. Richard's mouth opened, and before he could stop himself, before he could think about what he was doing, a single word escaped his lips, a word that would stop everything. Stop. The word echoed through the silent auditorium like a gunshot. Daniel's bow froze mid-stroke. The beautiful melody cut off abruptly, leaving everyone hanging in confusion and shock. This was the moment that would change both of their lives forever. The single word hung in the air like a physical thing. Everyone in the auditorium turned to look at Judge Richard Hampton. His hand was still raised, trembling slightly. His face had gone completely pale, as if he'd seen a ghost walking across the stage. Daniel stood frozen on the stage, his violin still positioned under his chin, his bow suspended in midair. The color drained from his face. His worst nightmare was coming true. The strict judge everyone warned him about was stopping his performance. This meant failure. This meant humiliation in front of hundreds of people. The other two judges looked at Richard with wide eyes. In all their years of working with him, they had never seen him interrupt a performance like this. Sure, he'd stopped people before, but that was usually after they'd made several major mistakes. This boy had barely started. He'd played maybe 8 measures, and they had sounded beautiful. The audience began to murmur. Parents whispered to each other urgently. What was happening? Why had the famous strict judge stopped such a lovely performance? Some people started to feel sorry for the young boy on stage, standing there looking like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Richard's chair scraped loudly against the floor as he pushed it back and stood up. The sound seemed incredibly loud in the tense silence. He gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. His breathing was uneven and his chest rose and fell rapidly. What piece are you performing? His voice came out tight and controlled. But there was something else underneath it. Something raw and emotional that no one had ever heard from the strict judge before. Daniel swallowed hard. His throat felt dry. This was it. He was about to be kicked out of the competition. His hands holding the violin and bow started shaking again. It's an original composition, sir. His voice cracked slightly. I call it Autumn's Last Dance. The moment those words left Daniel's mouth, something happened to Richard. His legs seemed to lose strength, and he had to put both hands on the table to keep himself steady. Several people in the front row gasped. Was the judge having a heart attack? Should someone call for medical help? But Richard wasn't having a heart attack. He was having something far more complicated, a collision between his present and his past, between what he thought was impossible and what was happening right in front of him. Where did you learn that melody? The question came out as barely more than a whisper, but in the silent auditorium everyone heard it. All the hardness was gone from Richard's voice. He sounded like a different person, vulnerable, confused, almost desperate. Daniel's confusion grew. This wasn't how he thought this moment would go. He'd expected criticism, maybe even harsh words about his technique or his composition. But this? The judge looked like he was about to cry. From my grandmother, sir. She taught me this melody before she passed away last year. Richard closed his eyes and took a shaky breath. The room seemed to spin around him. Memories were flooding back. Memories he'd kept locked away because they were too painful to examine. The other judges started to stand up, clearly worried about their colleague. One of them reached out to touch Richard's shoulder. She said she never finished it. Daniel continued, his voice growing softer. He didn't understand what was happening, but he could see the pain on the old judge's face. My grandmother wanted me to complete it for her. She said this melody meant a lot to her, from a different time in her life. The audience was completely still now. This had stopped being a regular music competition. Something profound was unfolding on that stage, and everyone could feel it even if they didn't understand it. Richard opened his eyes and looked directly at Daniel. Really looked at him, not just as another young performer to judge, but as a person, as a mystery that might hold answers to questions he didn't even know he should ask. Your grandmother's name, Richard said, and it wasn't really a question. It was more like a plea. Tell me your grandmother's name. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. This was getting strange, but the old judge looked so desperate that Daniel couldn't refuse to answer. Catherine Reyes, sir, though I know she went by a different name for a long time. She was Catherine Hampton for most of her life before she and my grandfather divorced when my mom was little. The name hit Richard like a physical blow. His legs finally gave out and he sat down heavily in his chair. Catherine, his Catherine. But that was impossible. Catherine had only been married to him, hadn't she? She'd mentioned something once years ago about a brief marriage when she was very young, but she'd never talked about it much. It had seemed like ancient history, irrelevant to their life together. But this boy was saying Catherine Hampton had been Catherine Reyes, that she'd had a life before him, a family before him, and apparently a daughter he'd never met. The other judges were talking to Richard now, asking if he needed a break, if he needed water, if they should call someone. But Richard waved them away. His eyes stayed locked on Daniel, searching the boy's face, and now he saw things he'd missed before. The shape of the eyes, Catherine's eyes, that particular warm brown color. The way the boy tilted his head when he was nervous, exactly the way Catherine used to. The delicate bone structure of his hands holding the violin. It was all there. This wasn't just some random teenager. This was blood calling to blood, family reaching across years of silence and loss. How? Richard's voice broke. How did she teach you? My wife, Catherine, she died 5 years ago. Daniel's eyes widened. You're Richard Hampton? You're the man my grandmother married after my grandfather? She talked about you. She said... He stopped, looking uncertain about whether he should continue. What did she say? Richard stood up again, moving around the judges' table, drawn toward the stage like a moth to flame. Please, tell me what she said. The whole auditorium watched as the strict judge, the man known for his iron control and harsh standards, walked toward a teenage boy with tears running down his weathered cheeks. Nobody knew what was happening, but everyone understood they were witnessing something important, something true and real and heartbreaking. Daniel lowered his violin slowly. She said you were the love of her life. She said she never stopped loving you even at the end. But she also said her biggest regret was losing touch with her daughter, with my mom, and she made us promise that someday we'd find you and tell you that she'd found us again before she died. Richard reached the stage steps. He climbed them slowly, like a man in a dream, until he stood face to face with his wife's grandson, a grandson he never knew existed until 5 minutes ago. The impossible had become real and nothing would ever be the same again. Standing on that stage looking at Daniel, Richard felt like he was falling through time. The auditorium around him seemed to fade away, and suddenly he was back in his living room 20 years ago. The memories came flooding back with such force that he had to steady himself against the microphone stand. It had been autumn then, too. October, if he remembered correctly. The afternoon sun was streaming through their large living room windows, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Catherine had been sitting at their old upright piano, the one they'd bought at an estate sale when they first got married. Her fingers were dancing across the keys with that natural grace she'd always had. Richard had just come home from teaching his classes at the university. Back then, he'd been a music theory professor, not yet the hardened judge he would become. He'd walked into the house expecting to find Catherine reading or cooking dinner, but instead he'd found her completely absorbed in her music. Listen to this. Richard, she'd called out without turning around. Her voice had been light, excited. She always got that way when she was working on something new. I've been playing around with this melody all afternoon. Tell me what you think. He'd set down his briefcase and walked over to stand behind her chair. Catherine had played a series of notes, haunting and beautiful, with a melancholy quality that seemed to capture something essential about autumn itself. The way leaves fall slowly, the way light changes, the bittersweet feeling of beauty that you know won't last. It's incredible, Richard had said, meaning it. Catherine was a talented composer, though she'd never pursued it professionally. She'd always said she made music for the joy of it, not for fame or money. What are you going to call it? I'm not sure yet, Catherine had replied, playing the melody again with slight variations. It's not finished. I keep feeling like there's more to it, but I can't quite figure out what comes next. It's like the music knows where it wants to go, but I'm not hearing it clearly yet. She'd played it several more times that evening, each time stopping at the same place, frustrated by her inability to find the resolution the melody was seeking. Richard had helped her make dinner while she hummed the unfinished tune, and they'd talked about maybe working on it together over the weekend. But that weekend never came. Not the way they'd planned. 2 days later, Catherine had collapsed in the garden. The doctors at the emergency room had run tests and found the cancer. Stage 4. Already spread throughout her body. They gave her 6 months, maybe a year if she was lucky and the treatment worked. Everything had changed after that diagnosis. The house that had been filled with music became filled with medical equipment. The piano sat silent. Catherine's energy went to fighting the disease, to trying to stay alive, to making peace with the idea of leaving. She'd lasted 11 months. 11 months of treatments that made her sick, of hope that faded gradually, of trying to be brave for each other. In all that time, she never went back to that unfinished melody. There were more important things to worry about than music. Richard had held her hand when she died. It was a quiet Tuesday morning in spring. The hospice nurse had stepped out of the room to give them privacy. Catherine had looked at him with those warm brown eyes, the same eyes he now saw in her grandson, and whispered, "I'm sorry I couldn't finish the song." At the time, Richard had thought she was delirious from the pain medication. He'd told her not to worry about anything, that she just needed to rest. But now, standing on this stage 20 years later, he understood. She hadn't been talking about her life. She'd been talking about that autumn melody, the one she'd never found the ending for. After Catherine died, Richard had gone through a dark period. He'd quit his teaching job. He couldn't stand being around music students. Couldn't stand their youth and hope and future when his wife had none of those things. He'd become a competition judge instead, because it let him stay connected to music without having to nurture anyone's dreams. And slowly, year by year, he'd become harder, more critical, less forgiving. People said he was strict, and he was, but really he was just protecting himself. If he stayed cold and distant, if he never let himself care too much about any of these young musicians, then he'd never have to feel lost like that again. He'd convinced himself he'd forgotten that melody. It had been 20 years, after all. Catherine had only played it a handful of times. He'd probably misremembered it, he told himself. Grief probably changed the memory, made it seem more beautiful than it really was. But the moment Daniel had started playing, Richard knew he'd been lying to himself. He hadn't forgotten a single note. The melody had been living in his heart all this time. A secret he'd carried alone, a piece of Catherine that only he possessed. Except he didn't possess it alone. Somehow, impossibly, Catherine had passed it on, to a daughter he'd never known about, to a grandson who now stood before him with the same musical gift Catherine had possessed. "She played it for you," Richard said quietly, looking at Daniel with new understanding. When did Catherine teach you this melody?" Daniel shifted his weight nervously. The whole auditorium was still watching them, but the boy seemed to have forgotten about the audience. "About a year before she died. My mom had finally tracked her down after years of being apart. They'd had some kind of fight when my mom was young, and they hadn't spoken for almost 2 decades. But my mom wanted me to know my grandmother before it was too late." Richard felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. Catherine had reconnected with her daughter. When? How had he not known? But even as he asked himself the question, he knew the answer. He'd been traveling a lot in Catherine's final year, going to competitions and festivals, using work as an excuse to avoid watching his wife die slowly. He'd thought he was being strong, giving her space, not smothering her with his grief, but maybe he'd just been running away. And while he was running, Catherine had been building bridges, healing old wounds, creating connections with the family she'd lost. She'd been finishing things that mattered even if she couldn't finish that melody. "She made me promise to complete the song," Daniel continued. His voice was soft but clear. "She said the melody had been stuck in her head for decades from another time in her life. She said someone she loved had heard it once, and she wished she could have played it for him one more time." "I think she was talking about you, sir." The tears were flowing freely down Richard's face now, and he didn't bother to wipe them away. The strict judge was gone. The armor he'd built around himself was cracking apart. He was just a man standing in front of a boy who carried his dead wife's music in his hands. "Play it again," Richard said, his voice rough with emotion. "Please, play the whole thing. Your version, with the ending you created." Daniel hesitated, looking out at the audience, at the other judges, at the strange situation they'd all found themselves in. But when he looked back at Richard and saw the raw need in the old man's eyes, he couldn't refuse. He raised his violin again, positioned the bow, and began to play the melody that connected them across time, across loss, across the silence of years. Daniel took a deep breath and closed his eyes. For a moment, he forgot about the competition, about the hundreds of people watching, about the strange emotional scene that had just unfolded. He focused on the music, on his grandmother's memory, on the melody she'd entrusted to him. The first notes came out pure and clear. Richard's entire body responded to the sound. It was exactly as he remembered, that haunting opening that Catherine had played in their living room all those years ago. The melody started soft and questioning, like the first leaves beginning to fall from trees, uncertain of where they'll land. Richard closed his eyes too. He could almost see Catherine sitting at the piano, her fingers moving across the keys. He could almost smell the coffee they'd been drinking that afternoon, almost feel the autumn sunlight warm on his face. The memory was so vivid it hurt, but then something changed. Daniel took the melody somewhere new, somewhere Catherine had never reached. The notes began to climb and dance, adding layers of complexity. It was still the same essential theme, but now it was growing, developing, becoming something more complete. Where Catherine's version had been melancholy and unfinished, Daniel added hope. Where she had captured falling leaves, he captured them being caught by the wind and lifted up again. The music became a conversation between sadness and joy, between ending and beginning, between loss and discovery. Richard opened his eyes and watched the boy play. Daniel's whole body moved with the music. His bow hand was confident now, all nervousness gone. This was what he was meant to do. This was why Catherine had chosen him to finish her song. The other judges sat motionless at their table. The audience was completely silent, afraid to break the spell. Parents who had come expecting a typical afternoon of student performances were witnessing something far more profound. Some of them had tears in their eyes too, though they didn't fully understand why. The melody built toward something, a climax that Catherine had never found. Daniel's fingers moved faster on the strings, his bow creating sounds that seemed impossible from such a worn instrument. The music swelled like a wave, carrying everyone in the room with it. And then came the resolution. Daniel slowed the tempo, bringing the melody back to something gentler. But it wasn't sad anymore. It was peaceful, accepting, complete. The last notes rang out in the auditorium like a bell, clear and true and final. When Daniel lifted his bow from the strings, the silence that followed felt sacred. Richard stood on that stage with tears streaming down his face, not caring who saw him cry. He'd just heard his wife's voice again after 5 years of silence. Not her actual voice, but something deeper than that. Her creative spirit, her soul's expression, her gift living on through this young man she'd barely known. For several long seconds, nobody moved. Then from somewhere in the back of the auditorium, someone started clapping. The applause spread like wildfire through the crowd. People stood up one by one until the entire audience was on their feet, giving Daniel a standing ovation. But they weren't just applauding his skill or his composition. They were applauding something they'd witnessed, a moment of genuine human connection, a bridge built across loss and time. Richard walked toward Daniel and did something he'd never done in 20 years of judging. He embraced the boy. He pulled this stranger, this grandson of his late wife, into a tight hug and held on like he was holding onto Catherine herself. Daniel stiffened at first, confused and overwhelmed, but then he hugged back. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he understood that this man had loved his grandmother deeply, and that somehow, through music, they'd found each other. "Thank you," Richard whispered into the boy's ear, his voice breaking. "Thank you for finishing her song. Thank you for finding me. Thank you for bringing her back just for a moment." The other judges eventually approached the stage. They were crying too. The whole situation was unprecedented. They had no idea how to score this performance or what to do next. The competition rules didn't account for something like this. But Richard didn't care about rules anymore. He pulled back from the embrace and looked at Daniel's face, really studied it. So many features he recognized. Catherine's eyes, definitely. The shape of the jaw was similar too. Even some of the expressions that flashed across the boy's face reminded him of her. "I need to talk to you," Richard said urgently. "After the competition is over. There's so much I need to know. So much I need to tell you. About Catherine, about our life together. About things I never got to say to her." Daniel nodded, wiping his own eyes with his sleeve. "My mom is here. In the audience. She'd want to meet you too. She has things of my grandmother's, photos, letters, music sheets. Things she thought you might want to have. Photos, letters, music sheets. Evidence of a life Catherine had lived before him. Pieces of her story he'd never known. Richard felt a strange mixture of pain and excitement. It hurt to think there were parts of Catherine he'd never understood. But it also felt like a gift, like being given a few more pages of a book he thought had ended. The competition coordinator finally climbed onto the stage, looking uncertain about how to proceed. "Judge Hampton, perhaps we should take a short break? Give everyone a moment to—" "Yes," Richard interrupted, his voice stronger now. "Yes, a break. 15 minutes. He turned back to Daniel. "Find your mother. Bring her backstage, please." Daniel nodded and quickly packed up his violin. As he walked off the stage, the audience burst into applause again. He gave a small, overwhelmed wave and disappeared behind the curtain. Richard stood alone on the stage for a moment, looking out at all those faces. These people had come expecting to see a music competition. Instead, they'd witnessed something far more rare. They'd seen a man's heart break open and start to heal at the same time. He walked slowly back to the judges' table. His colleagues looked at him with concern and curiosity, but nobody asked questions yet. They could see he needed space to process what had just happened. Richard sat down in his chair and stared at his hands. These hands that had held Catherine's as she died. These hands that had sorted through her belongings afterward, donating most of it because keeping it hurt too much. These hands that had clapped politely for thousands of young musicians while remaining emotionally distant from all of them. But today, these hands had embraced Catherine's grandson. Today, everything had changed. The walls he'd built around his heart for the past 5 years had crumbled in the space of one unfinished melody finally completed. He thought about all the years he'd spent being strict, being harsh, protecting himself by never caring too deeply about any of these young musicians. How much had he missed? How many moments of genuine connection had he pushed away because he was afraid of feeling something?
Catherine had taught Daniel to finish the song.
But maybe in a way she'd also sent Daniel here to finish something else, to help Richard find his way back to the man he'd been before grief turned him cold. To remind him that music wasn't just about technical perfection and harsh criticism. It was about soul connection and carrying beauty forward through generations. The 15-minute break seemed to pass in seconds. Richard sat there, his mind racing, his heart pounding, waiting to meet the daughter Catherine had never told him she'd reconnected with. Waiting to learn about the secret final chapter of his wife's life. Waiting to understand how, after 5 years of silence, Catherine had managed to speak to him one more time through the hands of a 17-year-old boy, with a worn violin and an unfinished melody finally made whole. Richard found himself backstage in a small room that was usually used for performers to warm up. His hands were shaking as he waited. The other judges had offered to come with him, but he'd asked them to give him privacy. This was too personal, too important. He needed to face this alone. There was a soft knock on the door and Richard's heart jumped. "Come in," he called out, his voice steadier than he felt. The door opened and Daniel entered, followed by a woman in her early 40s. The moment Richard saw her, his breath caught. She looked like Catherine. Not exactly, but enough that there could be no doubt. The same thick dark hair, though styled differently. The same slight build. The same way of standing with her shoulders slightly hunched like she was protecting her heart. "Mr. Hampton," the woman said softly. Her voice trembled. "I'm Lisa Reyes, Catherine's daughter." "Your wife's daughter." She corrected herself awkwardly, unsure of how to phrase the relationship. Richard stood up slowly. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Here was Catherine's child, a person who had existed in the world all this time while Richard had no idea she was out there, a daughter Catherine had made peace with but never told him about. "Please sit down," Richard said, gesturing to the folding chairs scattered around the small room. "Both of you." They all sat, the three of them forming a small triangle. The silence stretched out, heavy with things that needed to be said but nobody knew how to start saying. Finally, Lisa spoke. "I didn't know if you'd want to meet me. Daniel told me what happened out there, how you recognized the melody. I've been sitting in that audience for 2 hours, watching you judge other performers, wondering if I should try to approach you after the competition ended." "You knew I was here?" Richard asked. "You knew I'd be judging today?" Lisa nodded. "I saw your name on the judges list online. That's why I pushed Daniel to enter this competition. Even though it's a bit out of our usual range, I thought maybe Maybe this was the universe giving us a chance, but I didn't plan for it to happen like this. I thought maybe we'd just talk afterward, introduce ourselves quietly. Richard shook his head in wonder. The universe has a strange sense of timing. He looked at Daniel. And you? Did you know your grandmother was married to me? Daniel shook his head. Not really. I mean, I knew her married name was Hampton, and I knew there was a man she'd loved after my grandfather. But I didn't put it together until you said your wife's name was Catherine. We don't have the same last name, so I never connected the dots. Richard turned back to Lisa. Your mother never told me she'd found you again. In all our years together, she mentioned her first marriage maybe once or twice. She said it had ended when her daughter was very young, that there had been some kind of family conflict and that she'd lost touch. It clearly pained her to talk about it, so I never pushed. Lisa's eyes filled with tears. The conflict was with my father's family, not with her directly. But I was young and angry, and I took their side. I blamed her for the divorce for leaving us. By the time I was old enough to understand that relationships are complicated and people make mistakes, so many years had passed. I didn't know how to reach out. I didn't know if she'd even want to hear from me. But you did reach out eventually, Richard said. About 6 years ago, Lisa confirmed. I had Daniel and suddenly I understood things differently. I understood how much it must have hurt her to lose contact with me. I started trying to find her. It took almost a year, but I finally tracked her down. We started talking on the phone, carefully at first. Then we met in person. Richard did the math in his head. 6 years ago would have been a year before Catherine's diagnosis. She'd been healthy then, living her normal life. Their normal life together. Except it hadn't been their whole life. She'd been building this bridge to her past, to her daughter, and she'd never told him. The hurt must have shown on his face because Lisa leaned forward quickly. Please don't think she was hiding it because she didn't trust you or didn't love you. She explained it to me. You were traveling a lot for work during that period. She said you were stressed, busy, that she didn't want to burden you with her emotional journey. She said she wanted to be sure the reconciliation would stick before she brought it into your life together. And then she got sick. Richard said quietly. Yes. About a year after we'd reconnected, she was diagnosed. Everything happened so fast after that. She had treatments, hospitalizations. You were dealing with so much already. She told me she kept meaning to tell you, but the time never seemed right. And then near the end, Lisa's voice broke. Near the end, she was so weak. She could barely speak. I visited her a few times in those final weeks. Always when you were away at competitions. She made me promise I'd find you afterward, tell you everything. But then she died and I couldn't do it. Why not? Richard asked. And there was no accusation in his voice, only curiosity. Because I was a coward, Lisa said simply. You were grieving. I didn't know you. I didn't know how you'd react to finding out your wife had kept this secret. I was afraid you'd be angry, or that it would make your grief worse. So I kept putting it off. Weeks became months, became years, and the longer I waited, the harder it became to imagine actually doing it. Richard looked at Daniel. But you kept the melody alive. Grandmother made me promise, Daniel said. In her last months, she taught me that melody. She played it on my mom's keyboard. She was too weak to play it properly, but I could hear what she meant. She told me it was unfinished from another life and that someone she loved had heard it once. She said I should finish it, make it complete, and someday play it for the man who'd first heard it. She knew, Richard whispered. She knew that if you played it, I'd recognize it. She knew it would bring us together. Maybe, Lisa said. Or maybe she just wanted her grandson to complete something she couldn't. Mom always said that music was a way of talking when words weren't enough. Maybe this was her way of introducing us when she couldn't do it herself. Richard stood up and walked to the small window in the room. Outside he could see part of the parking lot, trees starting to change color for fall, autumn again. Just like when Catherine had first played that melody for him. Life seemed to move in circles sometimes. Tell me about her, he said, still looking out the window. Tell me about the Catherine you knew. The mother, the grandmother. I want to hear about the parts of her life I didn't see. And so Lisa talked. She told him about their reconciliation, about the long phone calls where they'd shared their lives with each other. She told him how Catherine had cried the first time she held Daniel as a baby, how she'd said it felt like getting a second chance at being a grandmother, not a replacement for the years she'd missed with Lisa, but a gift nonetheless. She told him how Catherine had taught Daniel to play piano and violin, how patient she'd been with him, how she'd never pushed but only encouraged. She told him about the last day she'd seen Catherine alive, how her mother had smiled despite the pain and said she was ready, that she'd made peace with her life and all its complications. Richard listened to it all, tears running down his face again. He was learning about a Catherine he'd never known, but also recognizing the Catherine he'd loved. The kindness Lisa described was the same kindness he'd experienced. The musical gift she'd passed to Daniel was the same gift she'd shared with him all those years. When Lisa finished talking, Richard turned back to face them. "I spent 5 years being angry," he admitted. Not at Catherine specifically, but at the world. At death. At the unfairness of losing someone you love. I became strict and cold because I thought that would protect me from ever hurting like that again. He looked at Daniel. "But you broke through all that today. With her melody, with her music. You reminded me that Catherine wouldn't have wanted me to become hard. She believed music should connect people, not separate them. She believed in hope and beauty, even when things were difficult." "What will you do now?" Daniel asked quietly. Richard smiled, really smiled, for the first time in years. "I don't know exactly, but I know I'm done being the strict judge everyone fears. I'm done protecting myself from feeling things. And I know I want to be part of your lives if you'll let me. I want to hear more stories about Catherine. I want to share my stories with you. I want to know my wife's grandson and my wife's daughter." Lisa started crying openly now. She would have loved this. She would have loved seeing us all together. "Maybe she does," Richard said softly. Maybe that melody was her way of making sure it happened. Catherine always was good at solving problems I didn't even know existed. They talked for another hour, sharing stories and memories, building a bridge across the years of separation. Outside the small room, the competition had resumed, but none of them cared. They'd found something far more valuable than any trophy or score. They'd found family, not the family any of them had expected, but the family Catherine had created through her love, her music, and her determination to heal wounds even from beyond the grave. 3 days later, Richard found himself sitting in a small cafe downtown, the kind of place with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls. He'd suggested meeting here instead of at his house. Going home still felt too raw, too full of Catherine's absence. But this neutral ground felt safe enough for what he needed to do. Daniel and Lisa arrived together right on time. They both looked nervous, like they weren't quite sure this was real, that the strict judge from the competition had actually wanted to see them again. Richard stood up and hugged them both, surprising himself with how natural it felt. "I ordered coffee," Richard said, gesturing to the pot on the table. "I wasn't sure what you liked, so I just got a variety of everything." They settled into their seats, and for a moment nobody spoke. There was so much to say that it was hard to know where to start. Finally, Lisa pulled a large envelope from her bag and placed it on the table. "I brought some things," she said. "Things I thought you should see. Things Mom left behind." Richard's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the envelope. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. The first one he pulled out showed Catherine holding a baby. She looked so young, maybe 25 or 26. Her face was radiant with joy. "That's me," Lisa said softly. "I was about 2 months old there." Richard stared at the photo. He'd seen pictures of Catherine from before they met, but never with her daughter. This was a whole chapter of her life he'd never witnessed. In the photo, young Catherine was sitting in a rocking chair, the baby wrapped in a yellow blanket. Her smile was genuine, unguarded in a way that only comes with new motherhood. "She was so young," Richard said. 24 when I was born," Lisa confirmed. She'd married my father when she was 22, right out of college. They divorced when I was 4. Richard carefully set that photo aside and looked at the next one. This showed Catherine and a little girl, maybe 3 or 4 years old, sitting at a piano together. Catherine's hands were positioned on the keys, teaching. The little girl's face was scrunched up in concentration. "She was already teaching you music," Richard observed. "Always," Lisa said with a sad smile. Music was how she communicated love. When words were hard, there was always a song, always a melody. I didn't appreciate it then. I was so angry at her for the divorce, for leaving my father. I pushed away the one thing we had in common." Richard went through more photos. Catherine at various ages, in her 30s, her 40s, always smiling in the pictures but with a sadness in her eyes that Richard recognized. She'd carried the loss of her daughter all those years. He'd seen that sadness sometimes during their marriage, usually late at night when she thought he was asleep. He'd wondered about it but never pushed her to explain. "These are from when we reconnected," Lisa said, pulling out a different group of photos. These were more recent, clearly taken with a phone camera and printed out. They showed an older Catherine, the Catherine Richard knew, sitting with a teenage Daniel at a keyboard. Her hair was graying, but her smile was bright, genuinely happy. "She looks different here," Richard said, lighter somehow. "Making peace does that," Lisa said. "She told me once near the end that reconnecting with me was like setting down a weight she'd carried for 20 years. She said she could finally breathe properly." Richard felt a complex mix of emotions. He was happy Catherine had found that peace, but hurt that she'd never shared it with him. Why hadn't she told him? Didn't she trust him? Lisa seemed to read his thoughts. "She wanted to tell you. She talked about it all the time. But timing was never right. First, she wanted to make sure our reconciliation was real and lasting. Then she got sick and everything became about survival. And then she trailed off. Then it was too late." Richard finished quietly. Daniel, who had been mostly quiet, spoke up. "Grandmother talked about you a lot to me. She showed me pictures of you two together. She told me stories about your life, how you met at a concert, how you proposed on a rainy Tuesday because you couldn't wait for a more romantic moment, how you made her laugh even when she was tired." Richard's throat tightened. "She told you all that?" "She wanted me to know you," Daniel said. "Even though we'd never met, she said you were the best man she'd ever known, and that if anything ever happened to her, she hoped someday I'd get to meet you." He paused. "She said you taught her that love doesn't have to be complicated. It can just be simple and true and steady." Richard had to look away, blinking back tears. This was Catherine, all right. Even dying, even keeping secrets, she'd been trying to build bridges to connect the people she loved. Lisa pulled out another item from her envelope, a small notebook with a worn leather cover. "This is her composition book, the one she kept all her unfinished pieces in. I thought you might want it." Richard took the notebook like it was made of glass. He opened it carefully. The pages were filled with musical notation in Catherine's neat handwriting. Some pieces had titles, some didn't. Some were just fragments, a few measures of melody with question marks scattered throughout. He flipped through the pages slowly, seeing Catherine's creativity laid out before him. Then he found it, the autumn melody. She'd written it down after all. The notes were there exactly as he remembered, with a note in the margin. "Played for R on October 14th. Couldn't find the ending. Feels like something is missing." Below that, in different ink, was a later note. "Taught to Daniel. Nov 2019. Maybe he can find what I couldn't. She knew she was running out of time when she taught me," Daniel said, seeing what Richard was looking at. "She didn't say it directly, but I could tell. She made me promise I'd work on it, keep trying to finish it. She said the melody was important, that it needed to be completed." Richard closed the notebook and held it against his chest. "This is precious. Thank you for bringing it." They sat in silence for a while, drinking their coffee, each lost in their own thoughts. The cafe bustled around them with the sounds of the espresso machine and casual conversation, but their small table felt like an island separate from the rest of the world. "I need to tell you something," Richard finally said. "Something I've realized since we met." He looked at both of them. "I've been half alive for the past 5 years. When Catherine died, I think part of me died too. I stopped teaching, stopped creating, stopped connecting with people. I became this strict judge everyone was afraid of because being feared was easier than being vulnerable." He took a deep breath. "But hearing that melody again, meeting both of you, it's like Catherine reached across death to shake me awake. To remind me that life is for the living, that music is meant to be shared and passed on. That family isn't always neat and simple, but it's worth fighting for." Lisa wiped her eyes. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to resign from competition judging," Richard said firmly. "I'm done being that person. I want to go back to teaching. Real teaching, not just criticizing. I want to help young musicians find their voice the way Catherine would have wanted." "She'd love that," Lisa said. "She always said your gift was seeing potential in people, bringing out their best." "I'd forgotten how to do that," Richard admitted. "But watching Daniel play, seeing how Catherine's music lives on through him, it reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place. It's not about perfection. It's about expression, connection, passing something beautiful forward." Daniel leaned forward. Would you maybe want to teach me?" I mean, I have a teacher already, but I'd love to learn from someone who knew my grandmother, who understood her music. Richard felt warmth spread through his chest. I would be honored. Truly honored. And maybe, Lisa added hesitantly, maybe we could get together sometimes. As family. I know we don't have a traditional relationship, but Mom clearly wanted us to know each other. It seems wrong not to try. I'd like that very much, Richard said. I've been alone for too long. I forgot what it feels like to have people who care, who share history, even if it's complicated history. They talked for another 2 hours, sharing stories about Catherine from different angles. Richard told them about Catherine's terrible sense of direction, how she'd get lost driving to places she'd been 100 times. Lisa told them about Catherine's obsession with collecting teapots, something Richard had noticed but never known started in her childhood. Daniel shared how Catherine had taught him to really listen to music, not just hear it, but feel it in his body, understand the emotion behind the notes. Richard recognized the lesson. Catherine had taught him the same thing when they first met. As the afternoon light began to fade and the cafe started preparing for dinner service, they finally gathered their things to leave. Richard held the notebook and photographs carefully, treasures from a past he'd never known existed. Same time next week, Lisa asked as they stood on the sidewalk outside the cafe. Same time next week, Richard confirmed. And Daniel, bring your violin. Let's start working on your technique. Catherine would want you to be the best musician you can be. They hugged goodbye and Richard watched them walk to their car. He stood there for a long moment, feeling something he hadn't felt in 5 years. Hope. The future suddenly looked different. Not empty and lonely, but full of possibility. Catherine had left him one final gift, not just the melody, but the family that came with it. 2 months had passed since that extraordinary day at the competition. Richard stood in the doorway of his living room, looking at the space with fresh eyes. For 5 years, this room had been a shrine to grief. He'd kept everything exactly as Catherine had left it. Her books on the shelves, her reading glasses on the side table, even her favorite blanket draped over the armchair. But today was different. Today the room was full of life and noise and laughter. Daniel sat at Catherine's piano, playing a piece Richard had assigned him for practice. Lisa was in the kitchen with her husband Tom, making dinner. Their 2 younger children, twins named Sophie and Alex, both 13, were sprawling on the floor with photo albums, asking Richard questions about the pictures. Is this really Grandma Catherine? Sophie asked, holding up a photo of Catherine in her 20s, laughing at the camera with windblown hair. That's her, Richard confirmed, sitting down on the floor beside them. We'd gone to the beach that day. She hated sand, but she loved the ocean. We stayed until sunset. She was pretty, Alex observed. Daniel looks like her. He does, Richard agreed. You all do, actually. You have her smile. The twins seemed pleased by this. They'd never met Catherine. She'd died before Lisa had reconnected with them. But they'd heard so many stories that she felt real to them anyway. In the corner of the room, Richard had set up something new. It was a professional recording setup, microphone, computer, interface. Over the past weeks, he'd been helping Daniel record his composition properly. Autumn's Last Dance was nearly finished. They planned to submit it to several young composers' competitions and scholarship programs. But more than that, Richard was collecting Catherine's music. He'd found more of her compositions in old boxes, scattered pieces she'd never published or shared widely. With Lisa's permission, he was organizing them, editing them, preparing them for a small memorial concert they were planning for the spring. The doorbell rang. Richard stood up and walked to the door, knowing who it would be. He'd invited some of his former students, the ones he'd taught back when he was a professor before he'd become the strict judge everyone feared. Professor Hampton. 3 people stood on the doorstep, all in their 30s now, but with the same bright eyes they'd had as music students. We couldn't believe it when we got your email. Come in, Richard said warmly. I'm so glad you could make it. The visitors entered and stopped short, surprised by the scene before them. This wasn't what they'd expected from the famously isolated judge. The house was warm, lived in, full of people and music. Richard made introductions. Everyone, these are some of my former students, Michelle, Robert, and James. They all went on to become professional musicians. I'm hoping to convince them to help with a project I'm working on. Over dinner, A chaotic affair with too many people crowded around Richard's dining table. He explained his vision. He wanted to start a music program for underprivileged students. Kids like Daniel who had talent but not resources. He wanted to provide instruments, lessons, opportunities. I've spent 5 years being exactly what music teachers shouldn't be, Richard said. Critical, distant, more focused on what's wrong than what's right. I want to spend whatever time I have left being what Catherine always believed teachers should be, someone who sees potential and helps it grow. Michelle, who now taught at a prestigious music school, leaned forward excitedly. I've been thinking about something similar. What if we partner with existing schools, provide master classes and mentorship? And I could help with fundraising, Robert added. He'd become a successful film composer. I know people who'd donate to a cause like this. The conversation grew animated, ideas flowing. Lisa came to sit beside Richard, putting her hand on his shoulder. Mom would love this, she whispered. She always said music should be accessible to everyone, not just people who could afford expensive lessons. Richard covered her hand with his. In just 2 months, this woman had become like a daughter to him. They talked on the phone almost daily. She brought the kids over twice a week. On Sundays, they all had dinner together, a tradition they'd started and committed to keeping. Daniel finished his practice piece and joined them at the table. Mr. Hampton, I've been thinking about the competition next month. Still nervous? Richard asked, a little, but mostly excited. I know the piece is good now. We've worked hard on it. They had worked hard. Richard had been teaching Daniel for 2 months, and the boy's improvement was remarkable. Not because Daniel lacked talent, he'd always had that, but because he now had guidance, structure, someone investing time in his development. But more than technique, Richard had been teaching Daniel what Catherine had taught him long ago, how to feel music, not just play it. How to let emotion guide the bow, how to breathe with the phrases, how to tell a story without words. After dinner, as the evening grew late, Richard's former students prepared to leave. They'd committed to helping with the new music program, and they'd scheduled another meeting to work out details. Professor, James said at the door, I have to tell you something. When I was your student 15 years ago, you changed my life. You saw something in me I didn't see in myself. These past few years, when I heard you'd become this strict, harsh judge, I couldn't believe it. It didn't match the teacher I remembered. I lost my way, Richard said honestly. Grief made me forget who I was. But you found your way back, James said. That takes courage. I'm glad to see you're yourself again. After they left, the house gradually quieted. Tom and Lisa gathered their children, preparing to head home. The twins hugged Richard goodbye, something that had become natural over the past weeks. Same time next Sunday? Lisa asked at the door. Wouldn't miss it, Richard confirmed. Daniel lingered behind after his family had gone out to the car. Mr. Hampton, I wanted to give you something. He pulled a flash drive from his pocket. I finished the recording, the final version of Autumn's Last Dance. I thought you should have the first copy. Richard took the small device, holding it carefully. Thank you, Daniel. This means more than you know. I'm going to dedicate it to her, Daniel said, to Grandmother Catherine. And to you, for helping me make it what it needed to be. After everyone had left, Richard found himself alone in the quiet house. But it was a different kind of quiet than the heavy silence he'd lived with for 5 years. This was peaceful, content, the quiet after a good day, not the emptiness of isolation. He went to his computer and plugged in the flash drive. The file loaded and he pressed play. Daniel's violin filled the room, playing the melody Catherine had started 2 decades ago. But now it was complete, polished, perfect. The piece built and swelled and resolved exactly as it should. Richard closed his eyes and listened. He could hear Catherine in it, her creativity, her soul. But he could also hear Daniel, young energy, hope, the future reaching back to honor the past. And maybe, if he listened carefully, he could hear himself too, the teacher he'd been, the man he was becoming again. When the piece ended, Richard opened his eyes and looked around his living room. The piano Catherine had played sat in the corner, but it wasn't silent anymore. It was played regularly now, bringing music back into this space. The photos on the mantel included new ones, pictures from the past 2 months, images of the family Catherine had created across generations. On Catherine's piano sat a framed photograph, not one of her alone, but a new family portrait taken just last week. Richard stood in the center with Lisa on one side and Daniel on the other. Tom and the twins flanked them, all smiling at the camera. A family that shouldn't exist by any traditional definition, but did anyway because of one woman's love and determination to heal what was broken. Richard picked up his phone and did something he hadn't done in years. He opened his contacts and scrolled to his former department head at the university. It was late, but he typed out an email anyway. "Dear Professor Chen, I hope this message finds you well. I'm writing to inquire about the possibility of returning to teaching. I understand it's been several years, but I believe I finally have something valuable to offer students again. I've remembered why I became a music teacher in the first place. I'd love to discuss opportunities if you're willing to meet. Best regards, Richard Hampton." He sent the email and felt a weight lift from his chest. This was right. This was what Catherine would have wanted. Not for him to spend his remaining years as a harsh critic, but to share what he knew with the next generation, to pass forward the gift that had been passed to him. His phone buzzed immediately. Professor Chen was apparently still awake. "Richard, what a wonderful surprise. Of course I'll meet with you. How about lunch this week? We've missed you. The students still talk about your teaching. I'd love to have you back." Richard smiled and typed a response, setting up a time. Then he walked to Catherine's piano and sat down. He hadn't played in 5 years, hadn't been able to bear touching the keys that she had touched last, but now, with Catherine's melody echoing in his heart and the memory of a room full of family fresh in his mind, he placed his fingers on the keys. He played the opening bars of Autumn's Last Dance, the melody Catherine had created, that Daniel had completed, that now belonged to all of them. The notes rang out clear and true in the quiet house, and Richard could have sworn he felt a presence beside. 6 months had transformed everything. Richard stood backstage at the Lincoln High School auditorium, adjusting his tie nervously. It had been almost 30 years since he'd felt this kind of anticipation before a performance, not as a performer himself, but as someone who had invested his heart in the musicians about to take the stage. Today was the inaugural concert of the Catherine Hampton Memorial Music Program, the scholarship initiative he'd started with help from his former students and Lisa's tireless fundraising. 20 young musicians from underprivileged backgrounds had been selected for the program. They'd received instruments, weekly lessons, and mentorship from professional musicians who volunteered their time. "Mr. Hampton, we're about to start." One of the student volunteers peeked backstage. "Are you ready?" "As ready as I'll ever be," Richard said with a smile. He walked out to the podium and the audience erupted in applause. The auditorium was packed. The front rows were filled with the students' families, parents who had never imagined their children would have access to quality music education. Behind them sat donors, community members, and Richard's former colleagues from the university. In the third row, Richard spotted his own family. Lisa sat with Tom and the twins. Daniel was backstage with the other performers, but Lisa caught Richard's eye and gave him an encouraging smile. Beside her sat Professor Chen and several of Richard's current students from the university. He'd returned to teaching 3 months ago and it felt like coming home. "Good evening," Richard began, his voice steady despite his emotions. "Thank you all for being here tonight. 6 months ago I was a different person. I had forgotten what music was really about. Not perfection, not criticism, but connection and growth and passing beauty forward through generations." He paused, looking out at all those faces. "My late wife, Catherine, understood this better than anyone. She believed that music was a gift meant to be shared, that every person with a song in their heart deserves the chance to let it out. This program exists because of her vision, her love, and her belief that one person's music can change the world, even after they're gone." The audience applauded again and Richard stepped down from the podium. The first student walked onto the stage, a young girl named Maria, just 12 years old, carrying a cello that had been donated to the program. Her family had immigrated from another country 3 years ago and couldn't afford lessons. But Maria had raw talent that reminded Richard of Catherine. Maria played a simple Bach piece, but she played it with such feeling that the audience sat completely silent, absorbed in the music. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. Richard watched from the side, his heart full. This was what teaching should be, not tearing down but building up. Student after student performed. Some were more polished than others, but each one played with genuine passion. Richard saw himself in them, Or rather, he saw the teacher he used to be reflected in their growth. They trusted him. They worked hard because he believed in them. He'd learned to balance constructive criticism with encouragement, to see potential instead of only flaws. Finally, it was Daniel's turn. The teenager walked onto the stage carrying his violin, not the worn instrument he'd used at the competition 6 months ago, but a new one Richard had helped him purchase with money from a small scholarship Daniel had won. The boy had grown more confident since they'd met. His posture was better, his stage presence stronger. "This is an original composition," Daniel announced to the audience. "It was started by my grandmother, Catherine Hampton, over 20 years ago. She played it for her husband once, but never finished it. Before she died, she taught me the melody and asked me to complete it. With help from Mr. Hampton, my teacher and my grandmother's widower, I finally did. This is Autumn's Last Dance." The audience settled into attentive silence. Daniel raised his bow and began to play. From the first note, Richard felt transported. He'd heard Daniel practice this piece hundreds of times over the past months, but tonight was different. Tonight, Daniel played it with complete mastery, with the kind of emotional depth that comes from truly understanding the music's meaning. The melody began as Catherine had written it, that haunting theme about falling leaves and the beauty of endings. But then it evolved, incorporating everything Richard and Daniel had worked on together. The piece became a conversation between past and present, between loss and hope, between ending and beginning. Richard closed his eyes and saw it all. Catherine at the piano, young and vibrant, searching for notes she couldn't quite find. Catherine teaching a teenage Daniel this unfinished melody, planting seeds of connection across years and silence. Daniel on stage at the competition, freezing mid-performance when Richard interrupted. The moment their eyes met and both recognized something impossible becoming real. And now this. The completion of a journey that had started decades ago with a simple melody. Catherine's music had brought them all together. It had woken Richard from his grief, reunited him with a family he didn't know existed, and reminded him of his true purpose. The piece built to its climax. Daniel's fingers flew across the strings, his bow creating sounds that seemed to fill every corner of the auditorium. The music swelled like a wave, carrying everyone with it toward some inevitable shore. And then came the resolution, the ending Catherine had never found but Daniel had discovered. The melody slowed, softened, and finally resolved on a note that felt both like an ending and a beginning. The last sound hung in the air for a moment and then faded into silence. Nobody moved. The audience seemed afraid to break the spell. Then someone stood up and started clapping. Others joined in, and within seconds the entire auditorium was on its feet, giving Daniel a standing ovation. Many people were crying, including Richard. Daniel took his bow, his face flushed with pride and emotion. He looked off stage at Richard and mouthed, "Thank you." Richard nodded, unable to speak around the lump in his throat. After all the students had performed, Richard returned to the stage for closing remarks. But when he opened his mouth to speak, he found he couldn't. The emotions were too strong. He stood there for a moment, struggling for composure, and then Lisa appeared beside him. She must have come up from the audience, sensing he needed support. She took the microphone gently from his hand. "My mother," she said to the crowd, "would have loved tonight. She believed that music could heal, could connect, could transform. Watching what Mr. Hampton has built in her memory, seeing these young musicians discover their gifts, this is exactly what she dreamed of." Lisa handed the microphone back to Richard. He took a steadying breath. "Catherine used to tell me that music is how we speak when words aren't enough." Tonight, these students spoke volumes. They told stories about dreams and hard work and the power of believing in yourself, and they reminded all of us why music matters. Not because it's perfect, but because it's human. More applause, and then the concert was over. People flooded forward, parents wanting to thank Richard, students beaming with pride, donors asking how they could contribute more to the program. Richard moved through the crowd, shaking hands and accepting congratulations, but his eyes kept searching for his family. He found them waiting near the stage. The twins rushed forward and hugged him. "That was amazing," Sophie said. "Did you teach all of them?" "I had help from many people," Richard said. "But yes, I worked with most of them." Daniel appeared, still holding his violin, and Richard pulled him into a hug. "You were magnificent. Catherine would have been so proud." "I felt her there," Daniel said quietly. "While I was playing, I felt like she was with me." helping me through the hard parts. Maybe she was, Richard said. I felt her too. Later that night, after the auditorium had emptied and the instruments were packed away, Richard's family gathered at his house for a late dinner. It had become their tradition. After every important event, they came together to celebrate and reflect. They sat around Richard's dining table, sharing food and stories from the evening. The twins acted out funny moments from the concert. Tom shared pictures he'd taken. Lisa looked at Richard with such affection that he felt his chest tighten with gratitude. I have something for everyone, Richard said, standing up. He went to his study and returned with a stack of folders. These are copies of Catherine's compositions, all of them that I could find. I had them professionally transcribed and printed. I want each of you to have a set. Lisa opened her folder with trembling hands. Inside were dozens of pieces, some finished, some fragments, all in Catherine's distinctive style. This is incredible. I had no idea she'd written so much. She was always creating, Richard said. Even when she was sick, she'd hum melodies. Music was how she processed the world. He turned to Daniel. And I have something special for you. I submitted Autumn's Last Dance to the National Young Composers Competition. You've been selected as a finalist. You'll travel to New York next month to perform it at Carnegie Hall. Daniel's mouth fell open. Carnegie Hall? Are you serious? Completely serious. Your piece is extraordinary, Daniel. You took Catherine's gift and made it your own. You deserve this recognition. The family celebrated late into the night. When they finally left, Richard walked them to the door and watched them drive away. He stood there for a long moment looking up at the stars.